Protect Our Province COVID-19 briefing is a regular panel of doctors and experts that address questions from the media and viewers at home. We are live streaming from the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples. Within a cross-Canada digital landscape, we wish to take time to acknowledge all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Please take a moment to reflect on your relationship with the people and the lands on which you are currently situated. Today's conversation is being shared in English and in ASL. To ensure access to completely accurate information, closed captioning will be uploaded after the live stream is complete. This national conversation for the public is being shared live on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. We are hoping to create a French language translation as well. If you are interested in regular information in French, please also tune in to our sister broadcast through Pop Quebec. Details can be found at www.popqc.ca. The views of our panelists are their own and do not represent any institutions they may be affiliated with. We have collectively gathered here as concerned Canadians, attempting to ensure that everyone in the country has access to as much information concerning COVID-19 as possible and the nationwide impact of regional policies.
From where you're joining us, thank you and welcome back. It's February 2nd, 2022, Groundhog Day. I've heard from a lot of folks that the experience of COVID-19 has conjured imagery of the 1993 film that shares its name, a day that historically looked for wisdom of what was to come in the weeks ahead. Would the cold and darkness continue, or would warmth and potential for new growth be just around the corner? In the film, the perpetual loop experienced by the hostile, judgmental, and unempathetic protagonist resonates strongly for me, especially today, with allegorical ties to events that have occurred over the last 2 years, amplified this week during the escalating divisiveness, pandering, and dangerous ideological narratives that are penetrating, influencing, and casting a horrifically dark shadow on society. One of the underlying themes of the film is the possibility of redemption, the moral philosophy of existence that embraces wisdom, knowledge, ethics, and time, so the protagonist may move forward, embracing what they have learned. If we as a nation are the protagonists in this real-life story, will we continue in the dark, frozen tundra shadowed by self-service and personal gain, or will we seek light and move forward with what we have learned yesterday and the yesterday before and the yesterday before to illuminate a new chapter of connected human experience? Today, we will be examining what we learned as a nation during the SARS outbreak in 2003, what we uncovered about our society during the outbreak, and our response once the crisis had passed. We will explore the implications of that experience and examine our response, exploring if we incorporated any of that knowledge into our policies and actions over the last 2 years. With us today, we have 3 experts from across Canada whose experiences and knowledge put them truly in a league of their own when it comes to their understanding of our national response. And I am so thankful they have offered their time to join us today. I'm going to introduce our panelists before we dive into some exceptionally insightful and reflective presentations. First, I would like to introduce Mario Pasami, who's a senior advisor to the Minister of Justice, Archie Campbell, on the SARS Commission and was responsible for pandemic planning and occupational health and safety. Assisting the wise, compassionate Justice Campbell was an honor of his lifetime. For nearly 3 decades, Mario taught at police academies in Canada and in the US, and led and participated in complex international money laundering, corruption, and fraud investigations, including the Bre-X gold mining scandal. Also with me today, I have Matthew Oliver. Matthew is an aerospace electrical engineer who has practiced for 35 years in a variety of disciplines, including forensic investigation and military flight test. He is presently responsible for the regulatory systems that govern about 56,000 licensed engineers and geoscientists in Alberta, and he is a citizen of the Métis Nation. Additionally, I am thrilled to welcome back Dr. Lynn Filiatro, a retired emergency physician and member of Protect Our Province, BC. Lynn spent most of her career in the emergency department at Vancouver General Hospital, where she also served as the emergency department quality improvement director. In 2016, after 20 years, she left clinical practice and went on to co-lead for 3 years the Vancouver Physicians Staff Association, a provincial physician engagement initiative. Once again, thank you all so much for joining us. It's lovely to see you. As today's topic is exceptionally robust, we're going to dive right in. Our panelists have all prepared presentations to share with everyone tuning in. And so I suspect most of our time today will be allocated to the sharing of this information. And it is such a unique opportunity to uncover knowledge of our past learnings. I, for one, am so excited to be able to sit back, listen, and absorb. If we have time after the presentations, we will take some questions from folks at home and or media. So I am going to pop two of our panelists back into our waiting room. And we are going to start off on the West Coast with Dr. Filiatro. Dr. Filiatro, could you take us back to March of 2003 and share with everyone what was happening in Vancouver and beyond when this novel virus, SARS-1, first came to Canada?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll bring you back to what happened that fateful day in March 2003. It started off as a regular day. Got to the emergency department 15 minutes early before my 7 a.m. shift and decided to spend some time looking at my emails before I started. And one of them, next slide, caught my attention. It was a memo from the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control that alerted us to pay attention to some atypical pneumonia cases that were happening in central China and the possible reemergence of the avian flu or the bird flu in Hong Kong. So I read the memo, didn't think much of it, and then went to start my shift. Next slide, please. I work in a teaching hospital and everything was going well up until about an hour before the end of my shift at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was standing at the nursing desk and suddenly I heard our triage nurse shout for help. I turned around and I saw her wheeling a middle-aged Asian gentleman in a wheelchair. And he looked visibly distraught. He was having difficulty breathing. As luck would have it, I was standing right next to our respiratory technician in the emergency department, and 3 of us with the triage nurse went to work. We did what we normally do, is pay attention to the ABC, airway, breathing, circulation, stabilize the patient, order investigation, portable x-rays, start IVs, etc. And it's only when this was all done, the patient was stabilized, that I turned my attention to his wife. And in talking to her, that's when the story unfolded. They had just got back from Hong Kong, where they had spent a few days. And her husband, had gotten sick there with fever, cough, and shortness of breath. They flew back the night before to Vancouver and then went to see the family doctor, who immediately sent them to the emergency department. And that's when the light went off or went on. And I suddenly recalled the memo and started thinking, what if this was the bird flu that I just read about? So we pulled out masks, and I must say, initially they were surgical masks, but we also changed our approach. And because I was working in a teaching hospital, I decided, instead of referring to house staff or trainees, to go straight from staff to staff communication to limit the exposure. And then the investigation started coming back. And more it seemed like it was a viral infection. I spoke with my mentor, who happened to be the physician who came on duty to replace me. And the charge nurse that was listening to the story decided to leave the sign out and immediately took it upon herself to shuffle patients around to empty one of our isolation room. And then within the next few minutes, she moved our patient into a negative pressure room, an isolation room. And that's essentially what happened. And like I said, when I left the shift, I just thought this was a funny, maybe bird flu or respiratory viral infection. But 2 days later, the story broke. This was a new disease. It was called SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. And next slide, please. And then what happened when the dust fell and things started to settle in the world, and we got over SARS, or we conquered SARS, I got a phone call to go to a reception. And it happened to be on a night shift, and it was at the reception from the BC CDC that wanted to honor me for having identified the index case in Vancouver and avoiding the worst catastrophe. So what I did is I turned the invitation down and instead sent my mentor. I went on to do my night shift. The reason being is that this had nothing to do with me. This had to do with a timely memo from the BC CDC, and had to do with a team of healthcare workers coming together with a shared and common purpose, treating the patients in front of them and making sure that whatever the illness he had would not spread to the rest of the department and the community. So there was no hero leader like we like to think about. This was a team effort. And so, next slide, the Vancouver General Hospital Emergency Department received the award for identifying and really setting the tone for how the SARS response was to be managed in British Columbia. This was in 2003. Next slide. I had refused every single interview afterwards. And it took 10 years before I spoke openly about that first index case and how we'd managed it. In 2013, while I was still practicing, I was part of a campaign to inform the public that if the index case of SARS presented to VGH Emergency Department in 2013, we could not do so well. At that point, the hospital was running at 120% capacity. On any shift, I had anywhere from 10, 20, or 30 patients admitted in the emergency department, which meant that my team was seeing patients in the hallway and in the waiting room. So if the index case of SARS had presented 10 years later in 2013 to VGH Emergency Department, the patient would have been sent to the hallway or the waiting room, infecting everybody around. We're now in 2022. Where are we at with our response? Next slide. It's obvious that a team is not enough. In order to have a successful response, be it to a pandemic or to serious illness presenting to the emergency department, you need a functioning healthcare system. You need servant leadership models, and you need resources. And by resources, I mean people, nurses, physicians, allied health. I mean stretchers, beds. I mean room, space, and I mean medicines as well. Without having all of this, you can't have a successful pandemic response. You can't have a successful emergency department. So in 2022, Where are we at? That's it.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Filiatro. When you spoke in 2013 around how 10 years after the response and the success that your team had with containing that first case in Vancouver of SARS, how it would not happen because of that lack of resources and capacity. Did you feel like anyone was listening?
It was the video that you saw there was a joint effort put together by the BC section of emergency medicine. There were a group of physicians that were supported by the, at the time it was the British Columbia Medical Association. And it was really a publicity response to really to inform the citizens of British Columbia and put pressure on the government. And it did help. We ended up with having more support for staffing, but the footprint of the emergency department did not enlarge. So you ended up with more physicians, but we ended up working in the hallway at triage, in the back office of the triage desk. And in fact, we expanded the hallway to put numbers in the hallways and pegs so we could put our IVs. So the footprint was still very constrained. And so we had more staffing, but not enough beds. And if you recall the last presentation by Dr. Noel Gibney, Canada is one of the OECD countries that has a limited amount of bed per capita compared to other countries. And that really put us on the back foot when the pandemic struck. So we have limited beds to hospitalize people. We have limited ICU capacity. And what we're finding out now is that before the pandemic, we didn't have enough healthcare workers, certainly not enough nurses. And now with so many having left, having burned out, or having or struggling with their mental health, it's obvious that we don't have enough for this Omicron wave. Just this week, the British Columbia government announced that 17,000 healthcare workers called in sick in the last week. Sorry, it's a long response.
It is exactly the purpose of today's conversation is for humans like me, just humans from across the country, to be able to lean in and take this opportunity to listen to your experience and the experiences of the other panelists today.
Mhm.
That way we can start creating tomorrows that don't keep repeating these problems that, what I'm hearing from you at the moment anyway, sounds like some investment we could have been prepared for, because we do know things. It's not, as much as it is a novel virus, it is not a new concept, given how successfully you guys were able to contain your index case of SARS-CoV-1. I'm going to bring you back up in a moment, Dr. Filiatro, as we make it through our couple of other presentations today. I'm going to invite Mario up to walk us through some of the things on the east side of things, as you're coming to us from further east, so Toronto, to share your experience from 2003 and what the work with the SARS Commission post that revealed, and how Hubris has contributed to the failure of our response when dealing with this novel and continuously evolving pathogen. Thank you so much, Mario. You are muted, so I'm going to unmute you. Perfect. There we go. And I will bring up your slides. Thank you again for being.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And Lynn's presentation was terrific, and it brought back some very strong memories. And my strongest memory of Vancouver General, where I spent quite a bit of time, was its esprit de corps. You know, the ability of its staff and its teams to work together and support each other was quite eye-opening experience. Next slide, please. So I want to start by taking you back to the long-term care hearings in Ontario in 2020, December 2020, when I testified before Justice Morocco. And Justice Morocco raised some very interesting points. He noted that the SARS Commission, which was conducted in Ontario between 2003 and 2007, the final report issued by Justice Campbell was well received, praised by everyone. But then he asked, the really key question. He said, even though that occurred, why has there not been a meaningful take-up of the precautionary principle? And so today, I want to make that the core question that I hope I can help answer. And it's one side of the presentation. So part of the presentation is going to be focusing on why haven't we followed the precautionary principle despite the evidence from SARS. And secondly, I also want to put forward evidence that, in my view, there was sufficient evidence at the beginning of the pandemic for us to have taken a precautionary approach right from the start. Next slide, please. So that's Mr. Justice Archie Campbell, who I worked for at the SARS Commission, and I tell you, he was a tremendous man, my mentor, my good friend. And he set out a blueprint, a roadmap that I think, had it been followed, would have put us in a much better position to effectively respond to COVID-19. So he landed on the precautionary principle as really the most important finding of his commission. And the principle is one that I think most of us lead our lives and try to teach our children. And that is, the point is not science, but certainty, but safety rather. And he wrote, we should be driven by the precautionary principle that reasonable steps to reduce risk should not await scientific certainty. Next slide rather. So in reaching that conclusion, he was influenced by the experience of Vancouver and of BC and how they handled SARS, and starting with the great work that Lynn and her colleagues did at Vancouver General, BC really deployed a precautionary approach throughout SARS, and at the end of it, they only had 4 cases. They really effectively contained, and I think they were the gold standard. In Toronto, and this is really interesting, while Lynn and her colleagues were dealing with the Vancouver index patient, on the same day, within hours of each other, the Toronto index patient presented to Scarborough Grace. And that patient was not dealt with as effectively as the one in Vancouver. He was not isolated. Staff did not wear N95s. In fact, he was left in a hallway for about, I believe, 12 hours, and that really began the SARS outbreak. There was another really important factor that influenced Justice Campbell, and that is, early in the SARS outbreak in Toronto, the decision was made by the leadership, which had really been cobbled together and was really learning by doing, if you will. They decided to mandate N95 respirators for all healthcare workers. They did this on their own, without the consulting of the approval of the infectious disease community. And the infectious disease community was quite angry about it. Said it was not necessary, and they said, this was a droplet disease. It's not airborne. It's not like measles or TB. And they continued long after to say that that the N95s were really an overreaction. Next slide, please. But what happened, interestingly, and there's a real parallel here to COVID, is that starting about a year after SARS, so in 2004, a number of studies emerged that SARS was an airborne disease. And so, just as Campbell said, and I've got it here on the screen, the fact that these studies, after the fact, showed that SARS had this airborne potential suggests the wisdom and prudence of taking a precautionary approach in the absence of scientific certainty. So, and there's a real ironic parallel. I'm not sure if I'm using the word ironic properly, but there's a real parallel with what's happened during COVID. In COVID, at the start of the pandemic, our infectious disease and public health leaders said we can rule out airborne transmission. We don't have to worry about it. And what happened is that subsequently, in quite a short order, in fact, studies demonstrated that that airborne that the COVID was indeed spread partly through the airborne route. Next slide, please. Why this reluctance to follow the precautionary principle? Well, history teaches us some important lessons, and not sure if many of you have read Thomas Kuhn's book, where he developed the term of the paradigm shift. It's heavy slogging, but it's a worthwhile read. What Dr. Kuhn found was that over time, going back to Galileo, science evolved through revolutionary change, and whenever that happened, there was always a group of experts who were tied into the old dogma, refused to change or see the new change, and they cause a strong clash with those who follow the new science. And so this clash between the old and the new, this clash between an old established group that fought to maintain the old orthodoxy has been part of science. Next slide, please. The classic example is from the 19th century, London, England, when Dr. John Snow conclusively demonstrated that cholera was a waterborne disease. It had been believed to be airborne, but his evidence was very, very, very strong. And he made this discovery in the 1860s, and it really dramatically changed the health of people living in the slums of London. In fact, radically transformed public health and epidemiology. Next slide, please. But many of those who had held the old approach to cholera, that it was a waterborne disease, held on. And the classic example was Max von Pettenkofer. Pettenkofer, for the 30 years after Dr. Snow's discovery, continued to argue that cholera remained, in his view, an airborne disease. And I think that some of the people who so strongly oppose the airborne transmission evidence and maintain their allegiance to the large droplet transmission theory risk being seen by history as associates, as followers of Max von Pettenkofer. Next slide, please. So, as I indicated earlier, towards the end of SARS, in the year after SARS, evidence began developing that SARS had been airborne. But what happened also was much bigger than that. Over the 17 years between SARS and the dawn of COVID-19, there was a huge growth in research in airborne transmission, in aerosols, in how diseases are transmitted through the air. One of the seminal researchers was Lydia Buruaba from MIT, and who's brilliant. And in 2014, she demonstrated that the 2-meter rule was really immaterial and outdated. And she showed that the large drop theory was based on 1930 science, based on a time when instruments were not sensitive enough to identify aerosols. And she and her team at MIT developed many of the wonderful graphics. I'm sure you've seen them. We have two people speaking, and you can see the turbulent gas, for example, in the air as they speak. Next slide, please. And there were many others like Don Milton at Maryland, who had started even before SARS and continued to develop this new research that brought him into the mainstream. Where when he first started out, people thought he was nuts. Next slide, please. And so, leading up to SARS, we have this golden age of research into aerosols. Really, a tremendous research, innovative, and really, really important. And this momentum of research continued during SARS. So, what I have here is a chart developed by Dr. McDonald from Ottawa, Jennifer McDonald, and I think it was accurate up until rather it was based on her research up until April, May of last year. And what she showed is that in short order during the first 4 or 5 months of COVID-19 rather, evidence of its airborne qualities was much more robust than for measles. And so, you have infectious disease docs always pointing to measles as a classic case. But this graphic really showed, and I commend Dr. McDonald for this, that in fact, the evidence of COVID-19 exceeded the evidence for measles and was done in short order. Next slide, please. And yet, what happened? What has happened, and it's really tragic, is that the infectious disease and the public health leaders of this country did not keep up with that wonderful science, with all those learnings, both between SARS and COVID-19, and during the early part of COVID-19. And part of it was that the infectious disease and public health leadership of this country has been resistant to other disciplines. So, this was maybe the most blatant example of it. This is Dr. Allegranzi from WHO, and she was, you could tell she was pretty angry, at all the questions she was fielding from the media, all the articles about COVID-19 being airborne, and she said, you have to stop. You have to look at who's doing this research. Well, it's engineers and aerobiologists and physicists and things of this nature, and this is not being accepted by epidemiologists and public health leaders. And the sad thing is that it really demonstrated this aversion to other disciplines, when in fact, what we needed and what we need is collaboration. One of Justice Campbell's recommendations was that public health agencies should bring in engineers and aerosol experts and all the disciplines that can impact disease transmission, so you get the best minds in a collaborative environment to deal with the issue. Next slide, please. And then the other really important factor that really also focused Justice Campbell in the importance of the precautionary principle was that SARS was a new disease. It was unseen. It was not something that we as human beings had dealt with before. And he said that we must be ready for the unseen. We can't treat. We must be ready for new diseases. This was a a view that WHO shared a few years ago when they warned about disease X, and disease X turned out, disease X, as they described it, was very similar to what COVID-19 is. Next slide, please. In fact, Canada prepared not for the unseen, but for influenza. The Canadian pandemic plan that Dr. Tam oversaw was the Canadian pandemic influenza plan. Dr. New admitted last year that that they planned for an influenza pandemic, and again, an important lesson from SARS, an important lesson from the WHO was really ignored, and they treated COVID-19 as if it was influenza. Next slide. And I think this was a statement made by Lisa Brosseau in March of 2020. At the dawn of the pandemic, we didn't know one way or the other whether it was airborne or not. The evidence was inconclusive. I will argue and have argued that there were good grounds for taking a precautionary approach. But at the very least, we did not have the grounds to rule out airborne transmission. Her very wise words were sadly ignored. Next slide. So just turning to the argument in favor of taking a precautionary approach at the start of the pandemic, at the start of COVID-19. As I indicated, lending weight to the precautionary principle was all that great research into aerosols. But there was also other evidence. Part of the evidence was that COVID-19's cousins, SARS and MERS, were both airborne diseases. And then lastly, and this is set out in this slide, was that there was good evidence, extensive evidence from Chinese scientists and doctors warning us that this is an airborne disease. And we have to be careful and disassociate the efforts of ordinary Chinese scientists and doctors to warn us about that from the actions of the Chinese government, an authoritarian state that has really not been cooperative in helping to find the causes and the roots of COVID-19. So, in February or March, Chinese doctors and scientists were telling us, go to airborne precautions, go to N95 respirators. This is an airborne disease. And they had done that. In late January of 2020, China had dropped the droplet precautions and had gone to airborne precautions. Next slide, please. So we go forward to July of 2020, a letter to WHO by Lydia Moraska and Don Milton said that based on the evidence to date on COVID-19, they said there's enough evidence to take a precautionary approach. And they made a compelling argument, in my view, that based on the precautionary principle, we should really accept and act in a focused way to mitigate airborne transmission. Next slide, please. In Canada, however, our infectious disease leaders and public health leaders were highly critical of the letter, of the approach, and they said there was nothing new there, nothing worth acting upon, and it was there was also a strong. Sorry, next slide. About a month after the Moraska-Milton letter, an article was written in opposition to the letter, claiming that it was not relevant, that it was premature, blah, blah, blah. And it was, and this is very significant, the leading writers of it were all Canadians. This was a Canadian response to the Milton Muraska letter, and about 40% of the signatories, and there were signatories from around the world, were Canadians. So it just demonstrated how strong the large droplet dogma is in Canada and amongst the infectious disease leaders and public health leaders. Next slide, please. What the infectious disease and public health leaders were looking for from Lydia Muraska and Don Milton was certainty. They wanted certainty at the level that we require when introducing new medicines and new surgical procedures. They want that level of certainty. While Lydia Muraska and Don Milton and those who signed the letter were saying, we don't have certainty, but we have enough grounds to trigger the precautionary principle. Next slide, please. And the precautionary principle is really best known in the climate change arena, where climate change deniers over the last 30 years have said we need more evidence, we need more evidence, we need more evidence, and as we've seen with climate change, we've waited far too long to act, and it would have been far better if we taken the precautionary approach. Next slide, please. Hubris, the title of my presentation, was a term that the ancient Greeks developed, and it was referring to a type of exaggerated self-confidence. Some say arrogance, and the opposite of hubris is humility. Next slide, please. Many experts, including Jack Coulihan, have talked about the importance of humility in medicine. How it should be part and parcel of the delivery of medical services. Next slide, please. But humility is also important in the face of a new pathogen. During SARS, we had a number of physicians testify that you have to be humble. You can't be arrogant. You can't think that you know everything. In the face of a new pathogen, humility is a key quality. Next slide, please. Dr. Fauci admitted this himself in a lecture to the Harvard Medical School in August of 2020. He had believed in the large droplet theory, but had come around to realize that, in fact, aerosols play a huge role in the transmission of COVID-19. And his quotes, he said, "You just got to be humble enough to realize that we do not know it all from the get-go, and even as we get into it." Next slide, please. And the final slide is really Dr. David Fisman from Toronto, who one of my heroes during COVID-19. And he said it's hard to say you were wrong, and he was a strong proponent of the large droplet theory, but he followed the science, and he pointed to the importance of doing that. And I think, just in closing, I think humility is a quality that's been lacking amongst our public health and infectious disease leaders. They've kept power to themselves, and they've been afraid to collaborate and work together with other relevant disciplines, especially engineering, which is why I'm so delighted that Matthew Oliver is able to join us. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Mario. Before we actually say goodbye and I pop you back into the back area and bring up Matt, I would love to know what January, February, and March of 2020 felt like for you, having that robust understanding of what the Commission had recommended in terms of embracing the precautionary principle and watching decisions be made by leaders across the world. What was going through your mind during?
Well, it was really heartbreaking. You know, I was in communication with colleagues in China and Hong Kong, and they'd gone to airborne precautions, and they were telling me what they were finding, and it was almost nightmarish because, you know, there were many people who knew what was going on, like Lisa Brosseau and others, who are warning governments, you know, let's be cautious. Let's follow a precautionary approach. Uh, in the face of it, you know, we were met with hubris, with our infectious disease and public health leaders saying, no, you're wrong. We don't have to worry about airborne transmission. Surgical masks are okay. Plexiglass is okay. Um, and you know they've not apologized, and I hope the time comes when they finally apologize uh, f- for what they've done.
Thank you very much. I have many thoughts formulating and many more questions that I would like to ask, and so hopefully we'll find some minutes at the end. Yeah, thank you. Hello, Matt. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to turn things over to you in a second to help deepen our understanding of the interconnectedness. We just spoke a bit about allied professionals or professionals that could be allies, other industries outside of direct hands-on care in terms of infectious disease and public health that really could affect and have affected and could continue to create a robust response when dealing with something like COVID-19. With, I don't know, those imposed boundaries and jurisdictional authorities, oftentimes I notice that our focus is very much on regional actions and reactions, which in a connected scientific, natural, and human ecology, jurisdictional actions flow way beyond those imaginary lines in the sand, and appreciating and respecting that interconnectedness, I feel anyway, is key for us finding our way back to that humility over the next year, 2 years, month, and away from that hubris that Mario was just speaking about. So I will pop your slides up and thank you so very much.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks to Dr. Lynn and Mario for those fascinating overviews. So I'm not a SARS-1 expert. I'm not a disease expert. I'm an engineer, and I'm not even a ventilation expert, so please don't ask me questions about fans. I'll refer you off to one of my expert colleagues. What I'm going to talk about a little bit is engineering and accountability, and just leading off on what Michelle said, I'm going to start by talking about systems engineering. I'm going to end by talking about Indigenous cosmology, which both talk about that interconnectedness. And when we talk about complex systems, they really don't care what side of a border they're on because they're going to do their complex system stuff. As you heard Mario talk about Dr. Allegranzi's comment, one of the things that's really characterized the pandemic for my profession and for my colleagues in the natural sciences is really a fairly active marginalization of our expert voices. So what I want to talk about on the engineering side is I'm not going to try and be critical about those things I've observed, but I'm just going to talk about engineering as a method. And you'll see the threads through that of the things where we can bring a direct comment on the pandemic. One thing I will say about the comment of hubris is that engineering is really defined by our study of failures. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but I will say as a forensic engineer that the failure modes I've seen clearly, particularly in public health policy in the last 2 years, the causal factors, I can trace those back to look a lot like the 737 MAX and look a lot like Challenger and Columbia. We don't really invent new ways to fail. Okay, so a couple quick things as I'm realizing that one of the things engineers fight against is our profession's not actually that well known broadly. And when I have encounters with high school students and they say, well, tell me what an engineer does, that's a nearly impossible question to answer. But what I usually say is, just take a look around the environment where we are now, and I want you to find something for me that is not engineered. And they very quickly realize as they find some what they think are good examples, and I explain to them how those things had been engineering touched. It really is impossible to do. And that engineering often involves systems that directly impact on our safety, but the broader public do not think about life that way. Part of the reason for that is because engineered systems have been so effective at protecting people. We take them for granted. Engineering is all about the transformation of the natural world to better society. But we're not always the first go-to when a challenge is faced because we hover in the background. Good engineering is often said to be engineering that's not noticed. And another reality is that our engineering is always interdisciplinary, as one of us rarely has the competence to take on all parts of a design. So an engineering natural response to a new problem is to pull together an interdisciplinary team that often includes non-engineers to bring those diverse perspectives to the table. Next slide. Now, one of the things we do bring is a deep understanding of complex systems through what's called systems engineering. And really all engineering is systems engineering. So that water treatment plant that enables your tea is one part of an immense system that begins with the headwaters and ends after a distribution system delivers it safely to your home. Those engineered water systems address serious public health challenges like typhoid from contaminated water, which we still had in Canadian cities in the early 1900s. And all engineering involves this understanding and controlling of complex systems which have unexpected properties that emerge unpredictably. Complex systems like the climate, like healthcare systems, like people's health. And the engineering method understands the natural creation well enough to design and model it to give us benefits as diverse as aircraft wings, to GPS, to flat screen displays. And much of this is directly applicable to pandemic response. It's a very unhappy irony in the pandemic conflict around the adequacy of knowledge that those who exclusively promote only one form of valid knowledge generation do so using hundreds of engineered systems, often ones that they trust their lives to, without realizing that those engineered systems arise from entirely different methods of creating knowledge. So it does raise the question, next slide, if engineering is everywhere and that involves complex systems that behave unpredictably, why are there not thousands of people killed daily by engineering failures? And that question really cuts to the core of who we are as a profession. Now, the first answer is that the engineering method creates knowledge and applies it in a manner that allows us to constrain and control those complex systems so that when something unexpected arises, it's a graceful event. And one of the big differences between engineers and the scientific community is that we rarely operate with scientific certainty. I think as an engineer, I would say that scientific certainty is a little bit of a myth. We're always engaging the practical world in a way that constrains it and allows us to transform it in a way that assists people. Now, the second aspect of that is that licensed engineers are ethically and legally bound to a code of conduct that places the general welfare of the public as our first priority always. And the undeniable success of the engineering method in serving society and a strong ethical foundation means that we don't have bridges and buildings and airplanes falling out daily. And when those things do happen, they lead to intensive investigations, often taking many years to determine the failure modes so we can adapt our methods so they never happen again. Engineering is a profession that studies its failures intensely, and defining moments like Challenger or the 737 MAX, Surfside Condo, these things remain in the engineering lexicon literally for generations. And even the iron ring that many Canadian engineers wear is tied back to a Quebec bridge collapse. And this is where the Hubris vaccination comes in. We wear it on our working hands so that as we're working, the ring is constantly brushing whatever it is we're doing, as a constant reminder that when engineers make mistakes, people can be harmed. Engineered systems shouldn't kill or harm the public we're bound to protect. Next slide. Now, a 90-degree turn into Métis cosmology. There's been a whole bunch of stuff in the pandemic that's hit me in very visceral ways on the Indigenous side. One of the things that colonialism is very effective at doing is silencing voices, and particularly those voices which stand up to challenge the dominant method. And one of the failures you heard Mario talk about is this lack of interdisciplinary engagement in public health policy, particularly through excluding the expertise of scientists and engineers. And early on, I found I was reacting very viscerally to that silencing, which I realized was actually a reaction to it being an expression of colonial violence and tying into my own family history. It's the same sort of trauma that our communities continue to experience. And this is maybe one of the learnings out of the pandemic, is that colonial violence isn't only directed at Indigenous persons, it's a characteristic of the system. So anybody that speaks out against it should expect they'll be receiving that sort of colonial treatment. Now, that silencing that we see in colonial systems is in sharp contrast to an Indigenous approach, which would understand that the wisdom and knowledge needed to work through a challenge is already present in the community. And we'd call that an interdisciplinary approach in science, but it's really core to how Indigenous live. And just as one last thought in conclusion, my observation is that Indigenous cosmologies are better at grasping the intrinsic complexity of creation. And one of the things I've seen repeatedly in public policy is that it attempts to apply very linear simplifications to reality. And that application of a linear simplification to a very complicated reality, it's a very, very colonial approach to complexity. So the two sides of my two-eyed seeing, as Albert Marshall said, one eye that's engineering, one eye that's Métis, both of them come together in this holistic systems engineering approach, or in the interdisciplinary approach that we'd see in Indigenous communities. And thanks so much for the chance to be here today.
No, thank you very much for making the time to join us for this, what's going to end up being just over an hour. I want to find a moment of hope and joy. I really, really do. So I very much appreciate you highlighting how some of the failures, from an improv theatrical perspective, I often view it as the no's lead to yeses. Like the strong, powerful, best no's are what lead to the absolute best yeses and opportunities. And so I really want to internalize that ideally we will find a way back into the humanity, that understanding of that interconnectedness, that appreciation of how much all of us as creators and thinkers and makers and discoverers and scientists can contribute to a robust, growing society that protects and tries to find new and inventive ways to keep us all in the conversation. On that sort of side, I'm curious, do you feel as a professional who has not had their voice listened to as much as one should be at this current moment in time, do you feel like economics has played a role in terms of the engineering side of things, and government's lack of interest in adopting airborne precautions over droplet? Am I frozen, or is Matt frozen?
No, sorry, I thought you were
no.
The question. I think that's certainly, one of the things engineers bring to the table is we take when we're working on design projects, economics are always a constraint. Certainly when we start to talk about the requirements for upgrading ventilation systems in the built environment, the existing buildings, to better provide that the high number of air changes per hour and higher grade filtration on recirculation that we need to actually remove pathogens from the air, there's a huge dollar figure associated with that, because HVAC units are not the sort of thing you pick up off the shelf at Home Depot and install on your weekend. They're engineered systems, they're complicated, and they're expensive. So I think the answer is yes. Economics is certainly a part of it. I mean, the shame is there are lots of alternative methods that are exceptionally cost effective, like supplemental filtration units, like the Corsi-Rosenthal box that we've seen. And maybe just to reflect on your comment about hopefulness and no's leading to yeses, one of the things that makes me exceptionally hopeful is the degree of citizenship, citizen science that I've seen done, particularly groups like parent advocacy groups that have become rapidly experts in ventilation in schools and are advocating for change in spite of there not being a significant level of leadership. So that is a great point of hope for me.
I have also often reflected and shared with our viewers at home the tingling sensation that I get around the creation of community and coming together of folks from coast to coast to coast that I never had the privilege of witnessing to the degree that I have over the last 2 years. And thank you for that reminder, Matt, that I'm going to bring everybody up into the conversation before we say our goodbyes for the day. Going forward, after listening to all of each other's unique perspectives on this and with your own robust internal knowledge, what do we need over the next year? And what do we need to prepare for disease X.2? Any one of you can start, and then we'll just build.
I can start. I think tying all the presentation together, at the end of the day, it's about humility. It's about admitting when you don't know, admitting when you're wrong, and admitting that this can't be solved by a single discipline or a single individual. It needs an interdisciplinary team from all the science. So sociology, engineering, aerosol, plus medicine, but not exclusively medicine. We need policy, sociology, all of that. And I always bring the lived expertise. We can't tell people what to do. They need to tell us what's working for their community and what is applicable. There's a local context and a local expertise that we never take into consideration. So I think it's moving from that hero leader that people seem to really want to that multidisciplinary team, taking the local context in consideration and a reiterative approach, knowing you're going to get it wrong, but you can learn from it, you can pivot, and then keep aiming higher. And that's, I think, where we need to go.
Yeah, I know. I agree 100% with Lynn. I think that the two aspects that Matt talked about, the engineering learnings and the Indigenous learnings, are really vital. And I've heard Matt speak a few times, and always find it very, very inspiring, because I think that we need to really learn from engineers, but also learn from the Indigenous science and wisdom, and really listen carefully, because I think they really hold the key to really dealing with future pandemics, but also to healing the colonial tragedies that have really damaged the Métis and other Indigenous peoples.
Thanks both of you for those wonderful comments. I think one of my focuses is in systems engineering and safety engineering. We often talk about the need for resilience in systems. And the modern thought of resilience isn't that resilience avoids bad things, it allows us to do good things better. So it builds the capacity to do good things in the system. And I think we're on a track for building that resilience, but that's really what we need going forward to encounter the next pandemic, whenever that might be. It means using the lessons we've learned and not shelving the COVID-19 Royal Inquiry report for another 20 years, so we can have this discussion in 2042. but learning from that and then figuring out what transformation needs to happen to build that resilience into the society from the bottom up, which includes hearing all the voices and bringing everybody to the table so we can leverage that wisdom that exists in our communities to find the best solutions for everyone.
I appreciated your comment on colonial violence, because it certainly has felt like that if you go against the people in power, suddenly media turns on you and you're being ostracized and also villainized. And it was something new for me. So I appreciate that comment to make sense of it.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. In the spring of 2020, I was quoted with some other people in an article warning about airborne transmission, the precautionary principle. And we were lambasted by a group of infectious disease doctors as being conspiracy theorists. And man, that just blew me away. But it just really ties into to Matt's analysis and perspective. And I really hope that going forward, and I think it may be helped by Matt talked about the fact that so many people, like those who organized this event, have informed themselves, have gotten involved, and have really become engaged in protecting their families and their communities. I hope we can move forward on that basis, but also, really, really carefully and with great humility, learning from our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Thomas Kuhn, Mary, in your presentation. I've really been enjoying learning about Ludwig Fleck, who Kuhn commented on very favorably, talking about how systems of expertise formulate themselves to protect themselves from outside influence. It's really a dynamic that we've seen quite clearly.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today. As always, this is an exceptionally robust topic that we never managed to make our way through in an hour, and we could sit here for weeks and discuss. For those of you watching at home, since it is such a robust topic, please feel free to revisit the broadcast, rewind, go back through. I know I will. There's a lot to unpack about the actions that we have made over the last 2 years, the actions that we have allowed to happen as a society to ignore and not embrace the learnings of SARS, MERS, and in all honesty, the learnings of our human journey. I am so thankful that we have had this time with these humans who have so much knowledge and an intrinsic relationship with what is affecting all of us every day, and that they are willing to give of their time to share with all of us humans, to give us that intrinsic expertise to the external. To the approximately 3 billion humans celebrating Lunar New Year right now, and to everyone joining us today, I do hope that the new year brings you prosperity, luck, and good health. And may this year bring an opportunity for us as citizens of the globe, as Canadians from coast to coast to coast, to utilize some of the wisdom of the last 2 months, the last 2 years, and the knowledge gathered and shared with us all by those who have faced these moments in history before, so that we can correct our current course and move towards the light that interconnectedness can bring. For those of you who have previously listened to our briefings on Spotify, please know that we have removed our briefings from their platform. You can still find an audio-only version of all of our briefings on our website, on Apple, and on Google. Tomorrow, Pop Alberta, as opposed to our national edition, will be back at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, taking a deep dive into as many areas of Alberta's response as we can manage with the hour that we have. And as always, remember COVID-19 is airborne. Wear the best mask or respirator you have access to. And I always say, and vaccines really do save lives. But today I would also like to add, so does every single one of us. Till next time, stay safe, Canada.